Welcome back to the Business of Defense, sponsored by ASMC on Federal News Network. I'm talking with Todd Johnson, Managing Director at BDO Public Sector, a wholly owned subsidiary of BDO USA, whose team of specialists and advisors possess both technical expertise and practical understanding of the public sector domain to bring lasting change and identify new opportunities for their clients. Todd, you mentioned earlier you were down in Huntsville. Can you talk a little bit about your path again to BDO, coming through Morgan Franklin, coming from the public sector side of accounting into the defense sector?
Sure. It's an interesting question. Honestly, I never thought I'd be where I am right now, if I'm going to be perfectly honest, right? So I'll go back all the way to the beginning even. You know, I graduated undergrad, master's in accounting. I go work for a large accounting firm in Atlanta. I'm doing outsourced financial reporting for CDC. I just actually, well, not just, my now wife and girlfriend had been dating for probably 8 months, right? At the time, the big firm I was working for had just kicked off, their quote unquote DoD audit readiness work in DC, right? And this was like 2008-ish, right? So anyways, I'd been at CDC and it was fine, but it was one of those things where, I'm from the Atlanta area, go to Auburn, come back. It's almost like high school, college, friends merge, right? This opportunity comes up. Had no designs on staying in defense, didn't even really know what I was doing. Again, went to my then girlfriend, now wife, and said, hey, we got this opportunity in DC. And if we stay here, this is it. And not that that's bad, but this is it. If we go do this, it's something new, right? And so she agreed, we moved up here, got engaged, all that, ended up getting married. And I started working in sort of defense audit readiness. I'll never forget the first client I had. They said, hey, we want you to look into balance sheet activities, in particular class 5, which is ammunition. And they said, hey, can you take a look at what we're doing? Now CDC, by the way, I'm not saying it's completely perfect either, but I will say they were passing their audits. So to come to a defense environment and they would say, hey, wrap your head around this $32 billion in class 5. I was like, wait, what are we doing? Right? Because it was a whole understanding of their APSRs, their property systems, how they're integrated into their actual ERPs. They were just at a different point in the life cycle. And I was like, this is amazing. I actually really liked it because, as I've said a few times, I do think this is the largest financial transformation in history. And getting into that and seeing it from the beginning has been an amazing experience. So I never planned to be in any of this, right? But we moved up here. I loved the work. And then we actually had my first son. I now have 2 boys, but I had my first son, and my wife really wanted to get back to the Southeast, right? And so I was actually going to get out of this. I was actually at one of your events. I was at a PDI in Orlando, and I was thinking about taking a job in IT finance with a big company in Atlanta, okay? And basically, a mentor of mine had dinner with me, and I told him what I was doing. And he said, what are you thinking? He said, you've been in this since basically the inception. You built relationships, this work. It'd be crazy to get out of it. So that caused me to think about it, all right? And he set me up with my same boss, Frank Landefeld. I had dinner with him the following night. And you've met Frank, obviously. And so Frank's a mentor of mine. And Frank was like, look, we want to build this defense practice at Morgan Franklin. We think you're the right guy. We don't care where you live. And so I said, would you be okay with me setting up shop in Huntsville? He said, absolutely. So we moved down there, we took that risk. Now basically the rest is history. We won, I guess we've got 4 or 5 contracts in Huntsville now. We've obviously got the ones up in DC. We've got a couple out in San Antonio, and then scattered throughout, right? So honestly, it's been a journey. It's one that I've been happy to be a part of. I really do love doing this work. And honestly, I'm thankful for Frank and Morgan Franklin, and then ultimately BDO acquiring us and the way this has worked out. So this is not something I planned on, right? Like the joke I tell people is, one of my largest contracts is environmental and disposal liabilities. If you'd have told me that I'd be reviewing environmental estimates when I was 22, I'd have thought you were crazy, right? So, it's one of those things where I think you work hard, you try to do the right things, and you see where your career takes you. But to say this was the plan would be a lie. But I love the work I'm doing now.
You certainly seem to know what you're doing, and I'm glad to hear that ASMC may have played some small role in that.
That's actually funny, yeah.
I want to transition a little bit in what's going on within the larger audit advisory consulting space. There's a lot taking place right now. A lot of people have heard about the big 4, your Deloitte's, KPMG, PwC, EY. But then there's the next tier, the next 3, BDO, RSM, and Grant Thornton. Of those 8, 2 have announced over the last 3 months that they're going to be splitting off their basically their federal practice or their consulting practices in some way. And there's rumors about others. What's your assessment of what's going on right now in this market?
It's a good question. So I'm going to say two things. I'll talk about the larger piece first, and then I'll kind of go back into just the public sector piece. From the larger perspective, right? And I'll say the name because I don't think it's any secret. Like EY has talked about breaking up their consulting and their audit practice. Obviously, I'm not privy to those conversations, but my guess is it's really two things. One, there's been a lot of regulatory pressure recently on audits. So earlier we talked about independence, right? So recently, there's been a lot of looking into sort of these big four accounting firms, and really all of us, I shouldn't just say the big four, let's say everybody in the top 10, right? And assessing, okay, so here is your revenue from audit, here is your revenue from consulting. Even if there's no conflicts of interest, even if there's no real independence issues, if those get way out of whack, right? Or even slightly out of whack, then regulatory bodies are gonna start looking into that and being like, okay, is there any conflicts here? Are there even perceived conflicts when all of a sudden you're an IPA, but a majority of your revenue is coming from consulting, right? So I think that's one big thing, is there's just pressure coming from regulatory bodies, okay? Two, I think that there's a reality, and I think this has actually been cyclical within the big accounting firms, is that when your consulting practice get to a certain size, it does put some strain on the organization. Why? Because you can't do audits for clients that you're consulting with and vice versa, right? So there does come a point, we'll just call it of saturation, where I do think even outside of the regulatory stuff, it makes sense to maybe look at what that, how that split is working and what decisions need to be made to make sure that you can still operate successfully as an IPA firm, right? And so I think it's those two things, which I think they're actually coupled together, if that makes sense. It's not one or the other, it's both, right? So I do think some of it's cyclical. I don't know that I think everybody's gonna go down that route, because I think there's ways to manage it and handle it so that you don't have to split, but obviously that's up to those organizations independently.
So it sounds like it's part of kind of the evolutionary process,
so.
and we're going to go through this cycle over the next maybe few years where there's some divestitures, some consolidations. What impact does that have then on the clients? Is this all transparent to the client? Is there something the client should be concerned about, or teaming partners?
Yeah, so it certainly impacts the client when they occur. I think it's still important to realize, even though we've been in this space of a lot of M&A, the major shakeups still don't happen all that often, right? Sometimes it feels like they do, because when they do, it's always very present, right? But they don't really happen all that often, right? And yes, I mean, there are rules in place for how you have to inform clients and contracting offices when these things are happening, right? So it really never should impact a client down at the execution level. Certainly from a teaming partner perspective, it can, right? Because you can have issues where somebody goes through a divestiture or they go through an acquisition, which can create an independence problem for one of their teaming partners. And so that certainly does happen. And when it does, it's something you have to assess in the market and try to pivot and navigate it the best you can, right? So it's not always an easy thing to do, but it's something that we're going to have to do as we continue to work through this. But I don't really think the client is impacted as much because of the steps you have to take prior to this to make sure that they're in the loop and that the key personnel they need are still executing for them.
So a firm like BDO then, and in your space where you're growing, how do you manage this? Are there opportunities out there as this is all taking place around you?
Sure, absolutely. I think that's the key, right? Is, to me, whenever there's these types of shakeups, there's always going to be opportunity. Okay, and so what we're looking at, if somebody is divesting, like we're looking to see whether or not they're an acquisition target for us, right? And certainly if it makes sense and there's synergies and they integrate well within, whether it's our defense or civilian practice or the public sector as a whole, then we're going to look at that, right? But then two, yes, I'm not going to lie about that. I don't think it really should impact clients day to day in the near term, right? But I certainly think there's situations where something like this happens and over time it impacts them, right? And why? Because when you have leadership changes and you have these big acquisitions to take place, typically what I'll call like your frontline partners or MDs that are running organizations, like they're going to stay the same. But it doesn't mean they're going to stay the same for the next 2 or 3 years, right? Because they've had a shakeup in the organization that can impact how they're looking at everything else, right? And that goes from them down to their senior managers, to their managers, to their senior consultants and consultants. So I think over time, you have to look at the opportunity there to pick up valuable people. And those valuable people, because let's be honest, it's really the people in this business, which is a service business, that shapes your client, right? So you want to get clients, get good people, right? That's really how this works. So from that perspective, if we're looking at a, like I said, 2 to 3 year horizon, I think there's big opportunity. In the immediate term, I don't think there is as much, but I certainly think 2 to 3 years, you have to be looking at that.
Great. Thank you, Todd. Thank you for your assessment of the situation, something we're going to have to keep a close eye on
sure.
in the future.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
I'd like to thank today's guest, Todd Johnson, Managing Director of BDO Public Sector, for his insights into BDO Public Sector's strategy, market, business model, and support to federal clients. Join us again next month, where we will bring you inside the companies working to drive transformation in the defense sector, to hear directly from their business leaders, and to understand how they create value for their companies and their customers. I am Rich Brady, CEO of the American Society of Military Comptrollers, and I thank you again for joining us. You are listening to Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search ASMC.